Few words now by way of introduction to our speaker today, Professor Steve Mason. Steve is someone who I suspect will be known to most, if not all of you here today. And after undergraduate and postgraduate education at McMaster University and the University of St. Michael's College, Toronto, and then apparently a short spell as a security guard, he spent much of his academic career at York University, Toronto, latterly as Canada Research Chair in Greco-Roman Cultural Interaction in the History Department, before becoming Kirby Lang Chair of New Testament Exegesis at Aberdeen University from 2011 to 2015. Steve left Aberdeen to become the first professor in ancient Mediterranean religions and cultures at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands in 2015 and is now Emeritus Professor there. Steve has specialized throughout his academic career in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean under Hellenistic and Roman rule, with a special interest in Judea, its neighbors and its diaspora communities, and Jewish-Christian-Roman relations until late antiquity. He's particularly well known for his work on Josephus and has edited the monumental expected 16-volume Flavius Josephus Translation and Commentary, published by Brill, and has written 3 of the 9 volumes currently published. Most recently, his translation and commentary on the Jewish War Book 4, published in June this year. His research output has been prolific over the years. Forgive me if I don't mention all of your books and articles, Steve, but to mention but a few, Steve has written Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees, Josephus and the New Testament, Josephus, Judea and Christian Origins, and most recently, in the particular interest to us today, A History of the Jewish War, AD 66 to 74, and what might be termed its companion volume, Orientation to the History of Rome and Judea, both published in 2016. Steve also runs the web project PACE, the Project for Ancient Cultural Engagement. And Steve has been a visiting fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin, the University of Constance, EHESS in Paris, and Wolfson and All Souls Colleges, Oxford, and has been awarded numerous prestigious honours and awards. Without more ado, over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony, for that extremely generous introduction. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And just one other thing to check. Okay, you can still see it?
Yep.
Yeah, excellent. Good. Well, before we begin, I know we're taking a bit of time, but I must thank Anthony and Sarah and Sheila for inviting me to join you. They know, and you all know, I'm not an archaeologist, so my first reaction to the invitation was to say that, but they very kindly and generously persuaded me that I would be safe sitting remotely here. You couldn't throw anything at me that would reach me. So I agreed to do this on the understanding that I'm a historian and not an archaeologist, although I benefited from your work, and many of you are archaeologists, of course, and try to benefit as much as possible. Dear colleagues, when I was 12 years old, I found myself leading a group of uniformed students in the suburbs of Sydney in pledging our loyalty to Queen Elizabeth II and to the flag of Australia that hung next to her portrait behind me. And she was a constant presence in my life as a Canadian and British citizen until indeed I received British citizenship and swore another oath of loyalty to her in 2010. I mention this only because this is a tiny slice in my life of what many of you have experienced with the late Queen. And I realize that this is a week of national mourning and Commonwealth and worldwide mourning in some ways. So I want to thank you especially for taking the time amidst all the blanket kind of coverage and tears and concern to join this session and hear my paper today. So without further ado, finally, let's see if this works. Can you see the advanced page, Anthony? Yeah. Is it the page advanced?
Yes, indeed. Sanguinary
Okay.
Jewish.
Yeah. Good, thank you. I think we're cooking now. All right. Well, as many of you will know, the kind of standard view of the war as a whole was that it lasted from 66 to 73 or 74, and that it was an intense conflict. And you see this in all kinds of books and articles. It's a baseline assumption that the Jews fought the Romans in a way that few others did, and the Romans had an extremely difficult time in Judea. That's why it lasted 8 years. I'm going to cite a recent book to this effect. Please understand that I'm not picking on this author. I use it only to show that I'm not pulling on a straw man here. This is actually said even until today. So Guy Rogers' recent book, 2021, it clearly took a massive effort for the Romans to defeat all of the Jewish rebels. The fighting lasted for 8 or 9 years, and there were tens of thousands killed. Now, I'm in no way picking on Guy Rogers. I like his book very much in many respects. One thing he does is he infers a lot from the consequences of the war. It was an important war, and the Romans made a great deal of it. Therefore, that suggests that somehow it's all mixed together, that it was a massive conflict lasting 8 years. My talk today is a part of an effort to think of it from a different direction, because I think that the consequences of great events, of which there is no doubt, I would agree, this may be the most consequential war in Western history in terms of its long-term consequences for shaping Western values and attitudes, and even the rise of the Flavian regime and all that. But that says nothing about the causes or the course of the conflict. And we all know this as historians. So if we look at the actual incidents of violent confrontations between Rome and Judea, we get a rather different picture. So there are very few of them, maybe 3 or 4, like this in 67, which is where we're going to focus. But even here, there's a big asterisk on the second one. The main conflict is in 70, the siege of Jerusalem, and then follow-ups far later. So these are the episodes, and nearly all of them are sieges. There's no guerrilla warfare except in the first one, and there are no pitched battles in the field. So there are a series of sieges, but not very many. And the rest of the time the rest of the period is blank. So just to walk through it very quickly, that first little band is Kestis Gallus expedition, which we'll look at in a moment. Then Vespasian arrives, and you have the famous siege of Viltapata, along with the little one at Jaffa nearby. The second siege there and the conflict is not, however, the reason it's asterisked is that it's Vespasian's favor to Agrippa II, which we will look at in a minute. By then, Judea is already garrisoned, and everything goes on hold when Nero dies. The Flavian campaign is halted, and it will be halted for nearly 2 years during this period. He suspends his campaign. He makes his own bid for imperial power. He retreats to Alexandria as his armies are fighting in Italy. And then he leaves the siege of Jerusalem to young Titus, but after depleting the forces in Judea very dramatically for the conflict in Italy. So the war is over from the Flavian point of view by then, and also from the point of view, I think, of reality in the province. Judea is now a Roman province with a legion, and as far as the Romans are concerned, it's done. Now you have a series of governors. They have their triumph for their great victory in Rome. You have a series of governors, and finally, they get around to taking back the fortress of Machaerus in the Transjordan, which seems most important to them, and eventually the very last one. These are on the frontiers with Nabatea, of course, Masada. So today, I'd like to focus on that year of activity before 70, which is in Galilee. What were the Flavians up to? Well, I must very quickly run through what I understand to be the context for this. How did the Flavians come to be in Galilee? Because obviously that conditions what their aims were. Now, not everyone may agree with me. I see a number of specialists in the group today, and I don't expect that you'll all agree with me, but I need to lay out very quickly my understanding of the basic situation here. So Judea under Rome, Judea is roughly this kind of shaded area down here. The conflict was not like provincial revolts, not like the German revolt early at 9 CE or the Batavian revolt or the British revolt, because you don't have Roman-trained auxiliaries or a province rebelling. To call it the Jewish or Judean War is not wrong, because it certainly became a war against the legions, but it's very limited in scope, and the causes were not like those of these other provincial conflicts. So the image of an 8 or 9 year conflict doesn't, I think, explain the evidence. We need to look at each stage along the way. I think the job of a historian is to try to put ourselves back in that situation and see things not from hindsight, but from, how they looked at the time as far as we are able. So our focus today, Galilee, why were the Flavians there? Was there a national revolt? What did they intend in Galilee? And in which parts of Galilee? So what is the significance of Galilee for understanding the war as a whole? Well, my understanding is that Rome's preference for ruling this region was to have a monarch in Jerusalem, simply to put the whole place under Jerusalem's leadership. We can't go into all the reasons for that. It wasn't, I love Jerusalem, but it was, they had sensible, realistic reasons for entrusting the region to a Judean monarch of the Herodian dynasty. Notice that when there were no Herodians available, they did not turn to the elites of other areas like Samaria or any of the coastal cities or the Decapolis, and did not elevate them to royal status. They rather put their own prefect in Caesarea and gave him special responsibility for Judea, as we see in the Pilate inscription, Praefectus Judaeae, even though Caesarea is not in Judea. So how did problems break out? This was all rather good for Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the regional power under Rome, but troubles broke out, especially with the Emperor Nero. Nero faces an increasing financial crisis. He's very young, comes to power at 16. He starts calling in loans, causes the Boudica Revolt. He sends his financial agents to raid temples around the empire to secure funds. The Great Fire of Rome, 64, exacerbates this. He entrusts his freedmen and equestrians with collecting the revenue, while he faces increasing opposition from senators, especially those who are in charge of large provinces. So in 64 to 66, as part of this general picture, he sends Gessius Florus to extract large sums from Jerusalem's temple. Now, what about the legate, that guy in the far north, Cestius Gallus at this time? Well, he has a bit of a problem on his hands because he can't act against Nero's men. And so he eventually is forced to make an expedition to the south to try to calm things down. And this is a little quick map of his expedition in September, October of 66. This sets up the whole situation in Galilee. That's why I'm talking about it. So he's a senator. He's near 70, it seems, and he maintains close ties with Jerusalem. He visits. He makes the 3-week trip down to Jerusalem at Passover of 66. He's sure that things are going well with the Jerusalem leadership. He understands that the auxiliary force raised locally and Gessius Florus, Nero's guy, are the problems, but he's hamstrung. He can't act against Nero's men, and he, as a senator, is very vulnerable at this point. When he hears that King Agrippa, his ally and friend, is expelled from Jerusalem, he reluctantly intervenes, brings his weakest legion on a police expedition, the 12th Fulminata, On the way, he hears about the Judean massacre of the auxiliary garrison and Judean raids throughout southern Syria. So he finds it necessary to show some display violence and intimidation to calm things down. This results, I have argued, that when he reaches Jerusalem, he finds the gates shut. He expected to enter the city with his large force and Agrippa at his side. But when he finally gets there, he's already faced some opposition as he ascends in the highlands, and he cannot enter the city. Nor can he besiege Jerusalem with the winter weather approaching, so he decides to return back north and plan a spring campaign. On the way, of course, famously, he's ambushed at Beit Horon, and the 12th Legion suffers a heavy loss. Now it's for sure that he will have to come back in the spring of 67. As it happens, he checks out. He appears to die at some point in there, and Nero sends Vespasian in his place. So very quickly, a neglected question here is, did Castius think that he was at war with Jerusalem, that Rome was at war? It's commonly assumed that he did think so, that he was incompetent in solving the war. I would argue that when he visited Jerusalem at Passover and his subsequent missions to get information from Jerusalem, he had no idea that Jerusalem was at war. He thought the elite was on his side and with him and with Agrippa. He sent a tribune in June with Agrippa on a fact-finding mission, and they confirmed that things were fine with the people and the elite. It was only the aggravations of Gessius Florus that were causing problems. Now, he was working with Agrippa. The Jerusalem leaders had asked Agrippa to send an embassy to Nero to confirm their loyalty, and Agrippa, for whatever reason, said, "No, I can't let you do that." They also appealed to Agrippa for help against the growing internal restiveness and violence. Notice, by the way, that Caestius Gallus took the quickest ascent route. There were 4 ways of getting up into the highlands, and he went up via Beit Horon, which he would not do in the war if he assumed there was a war going on. Titus did not use that route when he came later. He used the other 3 routes because it was a steep ascent, but the army was very vulnerable if there was a situation of war. So all this suggests that he was not planning for war, and therefore, if he had succeeded in calming things, Nero would not have held a triumph for it. This is all to frame how we look at now what happens when Vespasian arrives the next spring. There's an interesting passage in Josephus' War, book 6, where he has Titus address the rebels this way. "Look, my father came to the region not to exact retribution for the Castius affair, the ambush at Beit Horon, but to bring you to your senses. You may be sure that if he had come for the removal of this ethnos, it would have made sense for him to go straight to Jerusalem and sack the city. Instead, he kept ravaging Galilee and the surrounding parts, granting you time for a change of heart. But this looked to you like weakness, and you nourished your audacity on our gentleness." Now, rhetoric aside, leaving aside all the benevolent intentions of Vespasian and so on, we can discount that. But it makes strategic sense, right? Vespasian was in country with a large army. His easiest hand was to terrorize the people, sit there and let everybody know his army was about to attack and see if they would not surrender. And most people did. So I don't know why this is back there. So we can dismiss the benevolence motive, but still the strategy makes sense. Other Judean towns would indeed capitulate, so why not Jerusalem? Now, scholars generally, and again, I'm not picking here on Schatzman, just citing him as an example of the general view that Vespasian adopted a different strategy from Caestius Gallus because his goal was the systematic suppression of every area of the revolt. So this assumes, again, it reflects the general scholarly assumption that Judea was at war. Everybody knew that. Galilee was at war. It was in revolt. And so Vespasian took a kind of methodical, careful, slow approach in stamping out the revolt everywhere. So this assumes a nationwide revolt involving Galilee. What is the basis for that? Well, we have archaeology and we have Josephus's account. Basically, those are our two sources of information. Josephus's account runs roughly like this. Nero appoints Vespasian in Corinth to replace Cestius after his failure, and his mission is to subdue Jerusalem and destroy any Judean resistance. So he comes with overwhelming force. He collects some leftover legions from Corbulo, who have been sort of orphaned. Titus picks up the 15th Apollinaris in Alexandria. They meet at Ptolemais, Acco. The disgraced 12th Legion is not part of this scene now. And Moore's account has basically two distinct phases, which you might put in 3 acts in Galilee. First, from Vespasian's appointment to the fall of Yotfat. Second is efforts in Tiberias and Tarichea, which are quick, don't involve sieges. And then Act 3, the outlying fortress as well, the outlying fortress of Gamla and the towns of Ischala and Mount Tabor. So the 2 phases are the most important thing. There's his main job, which is phase 1, after which he says, job done, and then his favor for Agrippa. War 3 is mostly, however, about Josephus' own exploits. He's writing to flatter himself in large measure and to show what a brilliant general he was. But on a chronological map of 67, it looks like this then. Phase 1 is this 3-month period between April and June, and then you go to phase 2 when he does the work for Agrippa. What do I mean by this? Well, to orient ourselves, most of you who are here will know this intimately, many better than I do. But here's a topographical map, courtesy of Richard Cleave. So Sepphoris, the green areas here are the heart of Judean Galilee, which is on Vespasian's itinerary. So he comes and meets up with Titus at Ptolemais, and then he is going to just make sure everything is settled here and march south. What's not on his agenda, apparently, are Tiberias and Tarichea, because they belong to his friend Agrippa II over here. So Sepphoris is the major city. It commands the Bet-Netofa Valley and the region around. Over to the east, you have, of course, the lake with all of its connections. So Tiberias and Tarichea belonging to King Agrippa II, and then the Decapolis cities with their horai, their territories. Now, when the Flavians arrive, therefore, their target is Jerusalem. But as soon as they get to Ptolemais, they are greeted by embassies from all the surrounding cities, the Decapolis cities, Sepphoris, Tiberias, Tarichea. They all send delegations to welcome the Flavians, and therefore by April of 67, they instantly control the region, more or less, more than less. Because all the coastal cities are already in their hands. As Samaria, they fortify immediately, and everything is done. There is left only Jerusalem. This is confirmed, of course, famously by the coins of Sepphoris, which declare their loyalty to Nero and Vespasian. So in year 14 of Nero Claudius Caesar, it says 1 coin. And then it says that under or at the time of Vespasian in the peace polis, Irenopolis, Neronia, so even renamed in loyalty to Nero. So you can see the position of Sepphoris here, commanding the Bet-Netofa Valley on the hiking map, and from above, beautiful photos by Todd Bolin, thanks to him. Of course, this is later stuff that's in the ground, the later streets and the theaters and so on from 2nd and 3rd centuries, but it was the capital, and its situation did not change. It overlooked the valleys and commanded the field. So the Romans instantly dominated Galilee. Josephus says that as soon as they arrived, going out from both that is infantry and cavalry from Sepphoris, from a 7,000 strong garrison, and relentlessly overrunning the surrounding Chora, they brought serious trouble to Josephus and his men. He presents himself as the defensive general there and says he was completely overrun. He was hemmed in, he couldn't move. Outside of Sepphoris, he claims, the garrison of Sepphoris, in their fury at Josephus' efforts, did not stop. He attributes their walking over the area to their fury at Josephus himself. Yeah, that seems unlikely. But anyway, he claims to have had an army of 60,000 that he trained, but they instantly dissolved before seeing any of the enemy. So he was left alone. And he himself, he's not ashamed to say, fled as far as possible from the risks to Tiberias. He went to the cafes of Tiberias to stay out of the range of Vespasian. There's nothing he could do. He claims that Vespasian restrained his troops from killing, however, and paraded them with a view to creating terror among the Judeans so that they would change their mind about any kind of resistance. And it works, he says. It caused in many regret for any kind of resistance, and in all, terror. So, what about Iotapeta? What happened there? Well, this is the most famous siege in the only real siege in central Galilee. Why did it come about? Here's Motiavian's sketch of the defenses there. Motti thinks that this was built when the Flavians arrived. I'm not sure why it wouldn't have been built a few months earlier when Josephus was based there and in peril of his life from John of Giscala and his followers. But I don't know. And Motti is the archaeologist. There he is at Iotapeta. Now you can see from the north side, and many of you know this site very well. It's relatively easy to take from the north, not from the other sides. So there's the defensive wall. The north approach is easiest. And so what Vespasian does, according to Josephus, is he arrays his soldiers on the facing hill to the northeast, simply to intimidate everybody. Now, why did he bother attacking Iotapeta? Well, Josephus has a pretty clear story. It's a small town of families who happened to be friendly to Josephus in his conflict with John earlier. He says that before Vespasian's main army arrived, the tribune Placidas came to Sepphoris, throwing his weight around and trying to make a name for himself, and he wanted to show off. And he was overrunning towns, burning them, and so on, empty of populations for the most part. But Iotapeta somehow proved defiant. We don't know how. He attacked Iotapeta. Perhaps he was surprised. But in any case, he left humiliated. We do not know why. Maybe the residents had a lucky strike on some soldiers, but he left in humiliation. And so from now on, it was clear that he would be begging Vespasian to take retaliation on this town. In the story, Vespasian isolates Gabora, or Arava, 7 kilometers to the east, as a revenge site for the ambush of Cestius. He directs his soldiers, okay, you can take out your fury on this town, apparently largely empty. Josephus, when he finds this out and sees that Iotapeta is in peril, leaves Tiberias and the safety of Tiberias. By the way, he seems to be the only one we know of in the war, a significant figure to leave a place of safety, to go and put himself in harm's way to fight the Romans, or to at least try to negotiate a safe solution. So he leaves the safe territory to go to Iotapeta, the place with many hiding places, as you know. Vespasian adopts always low-risk tactics. He doesn't want to waste his legionary soldiers, so he arrays them on the hillside. Josephus is trying to be as conspicuous as possible to create terror. And the people are terrified, but Josephus claims that with him there, they wouldn't let him leave. He says, I wanted to leave. I didn't want to die there in futility, but they wouldn't let me leave. They thought their safety depended on my presence. So he says I became a general and pulled out all the tricks from Frontinus's stratagemata to try to defend the town. So Vespasian adopts a passive siege at first, try to starve them out and thirst them out. But Josephus claims that his ruses to pretend that they had lots of water and so on forced Vespasian into an active storming of the city. So War III, as I said, mainly illustrates Josephus' resourcefulness and character through these 30-odd days. He abandons his fate to God eventually, he says, and he surrendered. But it's clear that Vespasian expected no military opposition in Galilee. There was no Judean army, and he would have faced no significant opposition if Jotapata had not resisted Placitus and Josephus hadn't arrived to make the siege there more durable. In any case, even still, it was all done in 3 months. Galilee is settled by around July 1st. Now, this is crucial. After Jotapata's fall, Vespasian thinks that Galilee is in hand. The Romans control Galilee. And in Jerusalem, he says it's now known that they're coming for us. They didn't waste much time in Galilee, and they're headed to us. He sends already his legions to winter quarters for a long period of training and relaxation in the middle of 67 to prepare for the really challenging event, which is the only thing they're there to do, which is calm Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's up in the hills, of course. It will take a great deal of strategic and tactical arranging, logistical arranging, to build a platform for a siege up there. So they have to train and they have to plan. He sends one legion to Scythopolis, another two to coastal Caesarea, where Josephus goes. But Vespasian and some picked troops actually go up to Caesarea Philippi for a 3-week holiday with Agrippa II, because they want to celebrate their easy pacification of Galilee. And Josephus says he offers Thanksgiving sacrifices, that it's all done so quickly. It was really no big trouble. This is where I think we need to be careful and separate out this second act, the second phase, because Vespasian was not planning it. It was not part of his itinerary. But while he is there with Agrippa, this is what Josephus says. It was reported to him that Tiberius was in rebellion and Tarichea was breaking away, for both of these formed part of Agrippa's kingdom. And given that Vespasian had a mandate to suppress any Judean resistance, he urges him to help him. And notice the reason. By way of repayment for Agrippa's hospitality, he would teach his polis a lesson. Now, this meant, up there in the cool of Caesarea Philippi in the summer, this meant that he had to recall his legions from their winter quarters, where they'd already gone, bring them back from Caesarea and Scythopolis in order to deal with Agrippa's problem. What was Agrippa's problem, and why would his polis be in rebellion from Agrippa? Well, we don't know, but we have some clues. At least we can think about it. Tiberius, of course, was founded in 19 CE by Antipas, and this is a Greek-style city, a polis with a Greek charter, has proper councils, archontes, officials. It's not traditionally Judean, built on a tomb site. It's a prosperous resort town with Hamatabit nearby, the baths, the hot springs. There are Roman citizens and Herodian royals among its leaders. The lake is a source of commerce with a dozen other polis all around the lake on the eastern side, including the Decapolis. So it's a thriving place. And on the trade route, so you have two main trade routes coming from the Transjordan, one via Scythopolis and one over the lake via Tiberias to Ptolemais. And so it's in a very, very advantageous position. The leaders are, according to Josephus, pro-royal, pro-Agrippa. But there is a sailors' faction, especially, that is disaffected with his rule. Why? Well, one thing we may note is that just by 53 CE, the city was issuing these coins, which is quite unusual to be granted permission to issue city coins of low value. And that would not happen again because Agrippa II was given these cities in 54 or 55, we don't know for sure, And then he held them until he was dead. And it wasn't until much later, the late 90s, that these coins reappeared. So it stands to reason that when these cities were given to Agrippa by Nero, it raised some anti-Agrippa sentiments because the freedom of these cities, that is Tiberias and Tarichaea, would be lowered. Here's what most people think is Tarichaea, not everybody, Migdal or Magdala. So why the problems? Well, we can speculate. First of all, this city lost its primacy to Sepphoris among the Judean cities. And we know this for sure from Josephus' Vita. He has Justus of Tiberias complaining volubly about this loss of regional status. With an absentee owner, it loss of the right to mint city coins. It now becomes a property of Agrippa along with his other properties. There may have been, therefore, it stands to reason, there would have been new impediments to trade, new duties, for example, in trading across the lake. We don't know. We do know that they had problems with their rival neighbors from Vita 42, from Scythopolis and Hippos and so on. And it wasn't only Judeans who opposed Agrippa, because in Josephus' Vita 112, he talks about wealthy Gentiles who joined. They were cut from Agrippa's territories, and they came to join in the hostilities. Why did these tensions erupt now, 12 years or 10 years after Nero gave the cities to Agrippa? Well, we don't know, but maybe, Vespasian was in the territory with his big army, and they sent delegates to him to say, look, we have a problem with Agrippa. Can you help us? If they did that, they misjudged the situation, much as the Gadarenes misjudged the situation when they complained to Marcus Agrippa long before about King Herod. Marcus Agrippa threw them in chains and said, no, he's our friend, so deal with it. And it would have been what happened with Vespasian. He says, well, no, I'm supporting my friend. Or it could be that he was troubled by the attack on his palace in Tiberias. If so, that would be hugely ironic, because that attack was actually caused by Josephus. According to Josephus, it was his effort to win support by pretending that he had been given a mandate to remove the images from Agrippa's palace. So it may actually be that Josephus had some responsibility for this. In any case, Agrippa got word that his cities were being restive, and he wished for Vespasian's help, and Vespasian was only too happy to oblige. So quickly, he recalled his army, brought them up outside Tiberias and then Tarichaea, and then he chased the final unreconciled onto the lake. Josephus is a famous, vivid account of that destruction on the lake. So in sum, as a favor to Agrippa, he quickly restores Tiberias and Tarichaea. Even still, it's all done quickly. For the first phase by July 1st, and even the second phase by the first week of September. It's over very quickly. He doesn't need to besiege Tiberias or Tarichaea. He doesn't want to destroy them because they belong to his friend Agrippa II. That leaves Act 3, which is Gamla. Now, mainly Gamla. So this clearly was not on Vespasian's itinerary at first. He was planning, he'd already sent his army to winter quarters, as we saw. So what about Gamla? Well, this is still part of his favor. It's like the second phase, or Act 3, in his favor to Agrippa. Gamla's conflict, I would argue, I have argued, is mainly with Agrippa too, and not with Rome. Why? Well, for one thing, we know about this very sordid incident where Agrippa is absent from his kingdom, conferring with Cestius about Jerusalem, and he leaves his Iturian aide, Varus, member of a noble family, to run things in his kingdom. But Varus takes, or Noarus, or Anwar perhaps, takes advantage of the situation to persecute and try to kill the leading Babylonian Judean families in the region. They flee to Gamla because it's a natural fortress which has a long connection with the Babylonian Judeans. Agrippa hears about this, and he just hears that there's a revolt of some kind at Gamla. So he sends a soldier commander to try to besiege the place in late 66 to 67. There may be also now refugees joining them from Tiberias and Tarifa. In any case, this is what's left for Agrippa to deal with, and Vespasian offers to help out with this as well. He's very confident he can just go and storm the place, and he does, but he fails. And this is one of the remarkable stories in Josephus's account in War 4, where Vespasian he really causes a lot of death for his soldiers by being overeager and rushing into a storming of Gamla. It's not until Titus returns, interestingly, and he leads a more kind of a stealth attack on the town, realizing that it is well fortified, that they take it, and the population famously ends up jumping from the summit on the steep side, anticipating Masada. So here are familiar shots of Gamla. Now, what about the Gamla coins? They have been held. There are very few of these, of course. Only 9 are known, 7 from the site. I see Dani Sionis here, and I hesitate to say even a single word about these things. But anyway, I must. So of the 6,300 coins found at Gamla, my understanding is that no Jerusalem wartime coins are found among them. Only these 7 examples of a very crude coin, even with a strange script mixing Paleo-Hebrew and square script Hebrew. It's not clear what it says. Compare them, contrast them with those beautiful coins from Jerusalem. Of course, Meschler argued that what it actually said was, he proposed reading it from the front to the back, and argued that it really says, for the redemption of Jerusalem, the holy. That reading has been challenged because these letters are very difficult to make out. Farhi and then Stephen Fan had made different proposals for B Gamla or even Mi Gamla. So these are Gamla coins mentioning their town, and they were produced not in a spirit of revolt from Rome, but in the siege by Agrippa's commander in 66, 67. Of course, we don't know. I don't know for sure. But anyway, I don't think that they are clear evidence of participation in Jerusalem's troubles. Recall that Sepphoris forbade its citizens to get involved in Jerusalem's troubles, according to Josephus. And then finally, just to wrap this up, while Vespasian's forces are in the region, they also go down and take Mount Tabor, and finally Gischala, or Gush Chalav, known today. Titus takes 1,000 cavalry only to Gischala, while Vespasian leaves with the army. So he thinks that this is just a scouting expedition to wrap things up, mop things up. And Titus, when he arrives at Gischala, he realizes he can take the place by storm. It's not well defended. He's got 1,000 cavalry. They could just ride over. Josephus says he was tired of fighting, didn't want to do that. So he talked with John, and John tricked him. Josephus says flat out that John tricked or outsmarted or outwitted Titus, claiming that it was Shabbat coming and he should not be invading at Shabbat. Couldn't he just, leave it until the next day and everybody would happily surrender? Titus, in his simplicity of heart, says, okay, sure, that's fine. And he actually goes away to Kedesh, 10 kilometers away. And, of course, John escapes overnight. Notice that if Titus hadn't come knocking on the door, it appears that John would have stayed in Gischala. Although he will become one of the 2 major figures in Jerusalem later on, he would not have gone there if Titus had not come knocking. So, some scenes you're familiar with. And finally, the archaeology of wartime Galilee, to the extent that I understand it, and I'm not an archaeologist, supports this general picture. Everything I've read, at least from the coins of Sepphoris, capitulating and welcoming the Romans to underground hiding places and storage jars showing people fleeing from the Roman advance fits exactly with Josephus' account. Uzi Leibner's book, his survey of central Galilee, talks about 3 abandoned villages, but no evidence of great disturbance and increased resettlement at the end of the first century. So, where are we? Well, what I've tried to do is look at this period of the war to ask whether it really reflects this idea of a major anti-Roman revolt going on in Galilee in 67. And I've argued I don't think that's plausible, really. So the Romanes, or both Cestius and the Flavians alike, I don't see any big change in their strategy, was that Jerusalem was their main concern, as it had been for Cestius Gallus. But they were welcomed in most places, as they would be in the south. As soon as Vespasian moves down to Caesarea, the Judean capital of Perea sends an embassy to welcome him. And Jerusalem itself leaks all kinds of elite members who go to Vespasian in Caesarea and welcome him and ask him to help. And so he uses, as Cestius did, a lot of display violence to generate terror. By display violence, I mean these were not pitched battles against Judean forces. There were no Judean forces. There were no guerrilla fights. It was simply burning empty villages and chasing people and killing some who didn't get away. But he spares and consolidates the key polis, even the Judean ones, like Sepphoris, Tiberias, Tarichea, doesn't destroy them. Vespasian and Titus have no hurry. Galilee, why not? No perceived danger. They have the run of the place. And probably with all the crisis going on in Nero's Rome, it's better not to do anything conspicuous at the moment for a senator. As for Josephus, he flees a place of safety to put himself in harm's way. I like to keep repeating that because he has an opposite reputation in many circles. Now, to conclude, what about a thought experiment? We always read the past with hindsight, that's inevitable, as though the revolt led automatically to the destruction of Jerusalem. But what if, for example, Vespasian had not been delayed at Giltapata by Josephus, by Placitus, and what if he'd just gone straight to Judea in May? Or even if he had not been persuaded by Agrippa to help out with his stuff, which wasn't on his itinerary, wasn't part of his plan originally, that's clear. Well, this would have had all kinds of implications. He would not have sent Titus to Giscala. John would have had no reason to flee to Jerusalem. The so-called zealots would have been subdued by Ananus in Jerusalem and Jesus and the leading Pharisees because there was no John or Galileans to back them up. They would not have invited the Idumeans in, who are the ones who brought the muscle to kill Ananus and Jesus, because John wouldn't have been there, and it was John's idea. Simon Bar-Giora would not have been invited in, another outsider, to deal with John, because John wasn't there in this scenario. So, would Vespasian have not been able to subdue Jerusalem already in the summer of 67 if he had headed straight south and not needed to go to winter quarters, if Galilee had immediately capitulated? If he had done that, he would have had no reason to destroy Jerusalem. Presumably, Ananus and company would have been able to effect a surrender, which was apparently their intention, a safe surrender. There were no Idumeans, Galileans, or Simon's force to draw out the siege, no fighting to the destruction of the city, and hence no Flavian triumph. Now, of course, even in that scenario, Vespasian may have ascended anyway, with a restored Jerusalem as the showpiece of his empire rather than a destroyed Jerusalem. Could he have done that without destroying Jerusalem? Yes, I think so, because we know for a fact that Vitellius was already celebrating the destruction or the subjection of Judea from these coins that he minted in 69, before Vespasian completely controlled Judea, before the destruction of Jerusalem. That's all I have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. Really fascinating lecture, a very complex subject, I think, made very clear, and indeed the big if, the sliding doors of history, to bring in a Gwyneth Paltrow movie. I'm going to ask for some questions, but perhaps I can start myself with a couple, and they both relate to the very, well, I think the very perplexing Jotaparta episode. And the first question is, why did they not surrender? Now, you make the point in your book that they didn't realise that they weren't part of the Sepphoris gang, and indeed that may be true, but they had two options to do so. Once they'd realised, once was when they'd been perhaps unprovoked attacked by Placidus, and then when Vespasian decided that he needed to avenge Placidus's ignominious retreat. On both occasions, and the siege lasted, as you say, more than a month, however long it actually lasted. It was really a long time. They could have won up the white flag. Were they terrified that if they had run up the white flag, do you suppose that the Romans would have massacred them?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the, $64 or 64 million or whatever it is dollar nowadays question. In my view, it's something I've thought about a great deal, Anthony. And in my view, I've come to think of it this way, that much of what happened in that war and in any war happens because of fear. And it seems to me there's a fine line, a very fine line between being able to surrender safely and the fear of what happens if you are in the hands of the enemy soldiers. If you have, this is why I think the leaders of the cities rush out to meet the foreign conqueror. They always have, even through the world wars. It didn't matter who the conqueror was. The French cities, European cities would send people out ahead, as it happened in the ancient Near East. You send people out ahead to welcome them because you want to make very clear that you have no problem with them. You want to, whoever they are, they're just the ones with the power. So it's a wise thing to do, because if you force them to come knocking on your door and they are uncertain of your affections or disaffections, you risk a very serious consequence. What strikes me, Anthony, is I actually just sent off an article yesterday for a German publication called Der Limes on rape in the Judean War. It's striking that no scenes of rape, of course, are depicted, but they wouldn't be for reasons of decorum. But what you find both in Josephus' speech at Jotaparta, one of his encouraging speeches, and especially in Eleazar at Masada, that the risk of violation, if you feel you've crossed a line in the enemy's view of you, and you look like an enemy to them, you're the nail to their hammer, then you really risk. One of the things that Eleazar keeps repeating is we cannot tolerate seeing our women folk and our daughters in the hands of enemy soldiers. Now, rape is just the clearest example, but it seems to me the torture of men, the who knows what's going to happen if you fall into the hands of enemy soldiers. That's why at Saipan in the Second World War, famously Japanese families were jumping from the cliffs because they'd been told that the U.S. Marines were savage rapists and killers, torturers, and so they preferred to jump from the cliffs, and this you can see on video, and we know it happened, to risking falling into the hands of the enemy. So it's a long answer, Anthony, but my general sense is that once they'd crossed a line, my guess is that once they'd crossed a line and they had not been able to surrender peacefully, they did not know what would happen to them in the Roman hands, and that fear was a big driver of holding out. Because once you're in that position, the standard view is you might as well hold out. or eventually kill yourselves rather than fall into the enemy hands.
No, very fair. And if I may, before throwing this open, a quick archaeology question, which is that Josephus tells us, perhaps with typical exaggeration, that at the end of the siege there were 40,000 dead. But I think I'm right in saying that we've only discovered 4 skeletons. What's happened to the other 39,996?
That kind of thing. I think the top
we're getting some
1,500, 2,000.
See, we're not hearing, or at least I'm not.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interruption from.
Oh, I'm hearing you fine.
No,
you can't hear me?
No, that seems much better now. Sorry, with the there was a.
Okay. Yeah, what happens to skeletons? I have no idea. Hyenas and so on take care of much of that, but we can see that the town could only hold, I think, about 1,500 to 2,000. So these numbers are way out of whack. But Josephus talks about 1 million odd killed in Jerusalem. So his numbers are large. Usually you can divide, or many times you can divide by 100 and still get on the high side of plausibility with his numbers, and very often at least divide by 10. I mean, he talks about Cestius Gallus addressing 3 million when he visits Jerusalem, for example. So I wouldn't worry about the numbers.
For sure, but even if we're talking about between 2 and maybe 5,000 max people, would we not have expected to see more skeletons? And if we don't, then what does that tell us about the veracity of the middle of Book 3?
I never expect to see skeletons anywhere. I think it's a surprise if you find them, rather. I wouldn't expect that from 2,000 years ago, skeletons would just be sitting around. Animals are pretty creative, that have been haunting the area for a long time. But the veracity issue, I think I just don't think of it that way. I think Josephus' narratives are one thing, and the question of what really happened is another thing. Tessa and I have I see Tessa's there. Tessa and I have talked about this on a number of occasions, how we go about this. But I just don't think you can infer. I don't think we ought to be looking for a veracious narrative, a true narrative that we can follow. His narrative is one thing, and we try to understand it, and then we try to solve our historical problems. I don't think there's a direct connection between those two things, because not to say he's wrong in a priori, just to say he's telling his story for his own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
That is what he's doing. But our job is to try to figure out what happened, and it's I don't think I need to deal with the skeleton issue.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Now we have a question from Jeff. Forgive me if I pronounce it Barnoff, which I'm going to ask him to ask you himself. So if you'd like to unmute, Jeff. No, we're not getting there. Let me ask it anyway. Jeff asks, and indeed thanks you for the wonderful presentation. Have you written on his account of Masada? And is there some element to there also of self-serving or would not? That's the essence of Jeff's question.
I have written on Masada in the book. Is that the question directed
yes.
to me? Yeah. Not to universal praise and acclaim, I must say. Some people have taken sharp issue with my. But all I'm really doing, I think it's widely misunderstood, especially the article that was published on my chapter on Masada in Scripta Classica Israelica. Misperceives what I'm doing there. I'm asking questions, trying to solve problems, and entertaining a wide range of possibilities and weighing the different hypotheses. I'm not I don't claim to know. I'm not advocating this is what happened. I'm trying to investigate the problem. So is Josephus' account self-serving? Yeah, sure. I think it's clear. His end game for, I see the war as a very profound book, even though we shouldn't just use it as a guide to what happened. It's a meditation on freedom, in my view, essentially. What does political freedom mean? And he has Eleazar, he writes all the speeches, of course, and he has Eleazar at the end basically say, we misread God's intention, we screwed up, now it's time to die. So that's the end of the radical freedom campaign. There's no way to live. And then he has to go on and persuade people that life in the body is not actually God's plan. The sooner we get rid of the body, as the Indians know, the better. This is craziness and not very Jewish in its whole tenor, I think. So he's self-serving, but not in a direct way. He's serving the interest of his narrative, which is to make his important points about, what is political freedom. It's not radical freedom. It's not, utter independence. It's a negotiated freedom. It's what the Hasmoneans did. They always worked with allies to create their freedom. It's not just you being on your own, isolated in the world.
Thank you. Now, I have a question from Tessa Rajak, but I'm finding it difficult to find her to unmute her.
She's unmuted, I think.
I'm unmuted.
Oh, excellent. Very good. Excellent. Tessa, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. I enjoyed that so much. Terrific. I'm just going to ask you about one dimension of this. About Agrippa's stuff, which, as you beautifully put it. Now, if you take a slightly different view of what's going on with Agrippa and accept a seems for which there's lots of evidence that he was useless from beginning to end and unable to control Jerusalem for the Romans, which after all he was supposed to do. That's the point of the great speech. Probably could have prevented the revolt altogether if he hadn't been so inept. Then you get a different picture of the Galilee. It's not so much Vespasian and Titus stepping in to help him with his own kingdom. It's rather his having created a mess there, which meant that the Galilee could well have exploded, and which was a sort of mess that the Romans couldn't quite get a grip on, because it was, Josephus, really, but for the veto, we would have had been pretty perplexed as to who is doing what there, and at least the Vita gives us some sort of coherent account, though then we have to square it with what's in the war. But overall, it's a confusing and therefore a dangerous situation, and these little sieges, I quite agree, they don't amount to many or to much, but they're not the sort of thing that the Romans would want to leave, and therefore they have got a Galilee revolt problem, including a radical faction there, to which and a sort of intermediate faction. And John does seem to be troubled beyond just having to flee to Judea from all of what Josephus says. So, interpretation of Agrippa's stuff.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really glad you're there, Tess. I wore a tie for you today because I know you like us to wear ties, and I wouldn't normally do that. So I'm very pleased you're there.
Well, I like beautiful ties like that one. Yes.
We see things differently, and the only way to really sort this out, we must sit down and have a meal sometime and work through the text, because I think it's very clear in war, for example, and war is promoted by Titus in some way. As you know, he gives a copy to Titus. I don't think he was in a position and to Vespasian. I don't think he was in a position to completely invent the most basic movements of the legions and things like that. And he makes clear that after the fall of Iotapeta, it's over, and Vespasian is offering sacrifices. It's done. He sends the army to winter quarters. So the extra for Agrippa, it seems to me, is clearly a separate, and this is generally overlooked as far as I can tell in the literature. It's all viewed as one united kind of revolt, but this seems to me crucial. So then you need to figure out, well, what's going on with Agrippa. I don't see him as quite as inept as you portray him. After all, Cestius was cooperating with him closely until the very end. I mean, on his trip down, he brought Agrippa with him. He entrusted Agrippa with Neapolitanus, the tribune, to give him the fact-finding mission in the summer of 66. And Agrippa had intervened, of course, when he lived in Rome. He had intervened in the favor of Judeans, like with the Cumanus business in 48-52 or the early 50s. So it seems that Agrippa II was in very good favor with the Romans, and that they wouldn't do that if he were completely inept, is my sense. Of course, I could be wrong. I wasn't there. I don't know. But I can't share your judgment that he had already proven clearly hopeless. Otherwise, Cestius wouldn't have been so, I think, so tight with him. And after all, as you know, he did send 2,000 cavalry immediately as an advance force to try to help the Jerusalem elite immediately on their request. So, and they did get in the city in the late summer of 66. So anyhow, I could go on and on, as you know, but I don't want to take time from other questions. If that's enough to hold you off until we can meet and have a good conversation.
Yes. That gets the ball rolling beautifully. Yeah.
Steve, thank you. Rami Arab has his hand up. I get to ask him to unmute and ask his question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. How do you place the skirmish between Josephus and Sila in the Bethsaida plain, as is written in Vita 70-73? I read your translation and I was very impressed by this.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you, Rami. I've seen your name very often, and thank you for your question. Of course, what you refer to is before the Flavians are around. This is in the period when Josephus he's got a very complicated situation going on, obviously. And it's difficult. I mean, I don't know. Tessa referred to the problem of, first of all, reconciling the war with the Vita, but also within the Vita itself, there's quite a bit of development. So his mission, as you know, Rami, according to the Vita, is he's sent with 2 other priests to persuade everybody to calm down and see what the Romans will do and reserve any weapons for whoever they are meant to be, the picked men or the something or other. But anyway, wait and see what the Romans do. In the meantime, he's got to deal with Agrippa. And for this purpose, he presents himself as being on the horns of a dilemma, that he is actually a supporter of Agrippa II, as he will prove to be later. I mean, we have to remember that when he writes the war, he corresponds with Agrippa freely. They exchange, he says, we exchanged 62 letters. So there must be some understanding there of general support, but his role is a tricky one. So when he goes into Tiberias, in this episode I referred to in 65-69 or so of the Vita, he says, I began to tell them that, I had authority from Jerusalem to demolish the images in the royal palace. But then he becomes furious when people actually act on this and go and destroy the palace or attack it and take goods from it. And then when the young men of Dabarita attack the royal, the royal entourage, and grab some stuff belonging to the king. According to Josephus, he quietly sees to it that it gets returned to the king. So I don't have a good answer to your question, except that what scholars have normally done with this is to say, well, come on, he's either on one side or the other side, and his actions betray his revolutionary longings, and then everything else is a whitewash after that. I mean, this was the view since, Lecker and Drexler, and it's been with us ever since. I just don't think that, because my sense of human life is that it's extremely complicated, and that people have conflicting loyalties and tensions. And Tess's 1983 book explored this in some significant measure, just the conflicting kind of pulls of somebody who is a member of the elite, a priest, and trying to be in with the people, and yet, not. I mean, if we look at the Middle East today, it seems that it's not all that different. Leaders, whether they're in the Arab world or in Israel, are always walking on tightropes, trying to please this group and that group and act in a certain way that may not reflect their internal, preferences, but they don't get to indulge those because they're public figures. So I don't know the solution, but I'm not attracted by the idea of kind of simple loyalties. Are you with us or against us? Are you a rebel or a collaborator or something like that? I think there's a huge range of conflict in between those two. That's not a very good answer to your question, but anyway, yeah, he presents himself as fighting the royal forces for sure. But on the other hand, he has great respect for them.
Steve, thank you. Danny Stein apparently has an answer to my corpse question. Danny, do you want to briefly just enlighten us?
You mean about the burials?
Yes.
Okay, at Yodfat, several dozen skeletons were found in secondary burial in at least 2 water cisterns. And the burial of the dead is one of the most important religious requisites. So it's quite clear that people came back at least a year after the siege and collected bones and buried them. So there are bones. Of course, I agree with Steve that the numbers Josephus gives are exaggerated. But yes, there are skeletons. At Galilee, on the other hand, we didn't find any.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask, and we need to close fairly shortly, I'm going to ask Anthony Shepherd to ask his question. If you'd like to, Anthony, unmute.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. See the very clear expositions of very complicated narrative material. My question is, I've often wondered why Josephus let himself get shut up in Josaphat. And I wondered if your view would be that Josephus, I think you said, had no guerrilla forces. Perhaps he had no understanding of how to do that sort of warfare, and therefore no alternative but to try to hold on to a fortress. I mean, okay, I know he says that he stopped from leaving, and that he was went there with the intention of on some sort of peacemaking exercise, but I'd rather take that as kind of attempt to justify himself after the event.
Interesting. He doesn't clarify why. I mean, I put in his mouth the sort of peacemaking as a possibility, and just inferring that from his later remark that he really tried to leave when he saw the situation was hopeless. I'm not so sure why he would invent that, because he's presenting himself as the great general throughout the war. Right from the prologue onward, he presents himself as this just brilliant guy who recruited 100,000 and put them through such a brilliant boot camp that 60,000 survived or graduated as his soldiers, and he trained them in column movements and all sorts of useless things. So I don't know how it would fit that picture of himself to say, it seems quite disarming for him to say, I really wanted to get the hell out of there when I realized I didn't want to die in futility for no reason. It doesn't look so good on him. So I don't take that as a point of obvious obfuscation. It may be. I mean, again, we don't know. I don't think we can infer from the narrative exactly what happened. But so why did he let himself get caught up there? I really think that we tend to import our value systems to the ancient world always. And we think, I mean, I've talked with so many people, especially members of the general public, who write to me saying, you should follow the money, like who's paying for this and where's the money? That kind of modern, obsession. I just think that the ancients really did have a different value system. And it's not so weird that somebody, especially if he tried to leave and couldn't, they forced him to stay, as he says, tried to make the best of it and delay the end as long as possible. I don't have any other good reason. I mean, he was in Tiberias, and he could have just stayed there. That would have been the simple thing to do, enjoy the scenery and stay out of trouble and stay away from the legions. Why on earth? That's what everybody else did. Or they fled to the security of Jerusalem's walls. So he really is the only one, as far as I know, who actually went from a place of security to put himself in harm's way. Why he did it, that Josaphat had been his base in this really lethal conflict with John of Giscala in the preceding months. And I can imagine the natural affection for the families that were about to be destroyed there.
I did once put the strategic question to a former lecturer in military history at Sandhurst, who said that his actions were not unreasonable in the circumstances. But he was an expert in fair.
Yeah, although I mean, what would guerrilla warfare look like when you have an army of, even if it's a bit exaggerated, you have at least the core of 3 legions plus maybe 18 auxiliary units and all kinds of cavalry just rampaging over the valleys and the undulating hills of Lower Galilee. What does guerrilla warfare look like when you've got a garrison of, if it is a garrison of 7,000, as he says in Sepphoris, but even if it were only 1,000, that's huge. What do you do as what we think of as guerrilla fighting? The Basque separatists or somebody, or in Latin America, or in the campaign against Napoleon. It's not necessarily possible in Galilee. What are you going to do if you say, I want to be a guerrilla fighter? Okay, what do I do now? There are no explosives to go and blow something up. And, what do you do when you've got an enemy with very secure bases and overwhelming military force? I think the simpler solution is that he had what he says. He had no interest in fighting in the first place. But it was his job to go there and try to sort things out. He'd already been on a mission to Rome in his 20s, so he was entrusted with a very serious heavy diplomatic responsibilities. So that seems to me the simplest solution.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to invite one more question, and then I think, looking at the time, we should probably bring this to a close. So I'm going to ask Rad Altner to ask his question.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Yes, thanks very much for the very interesting talk. I was interested in your views regarding the situation in Gamla and Jotfat, which we know that these 2 siege lasted pretty long, at least a month, when the Jews were confronting a huge Roman army. How do you see that thing?
Well, in Gamla, I'm not sure it lasted so long. the siege of Gamla itself, but let's say it was close to a month. We only have Josephus' description and then the archaeology. And not being an archaeologist, I hesitate to speak about it. I can only read what I read in the reports. But they seem to fit, more or less, with Josephus's narrative, which is that, there was a breach made. They tried to storm the town quickly. So according to Josephus, as you know, they couldn't encircle the city. There's no possibility, or the town, there's no possibility of a circumvallation, as it's often called. So they're foraging, right? They don't have supply lines lined up there. So Vespasian has every reason to get this over quickly, having a large army sitting there in the middle of nowhere in the Golan. He wants to get it over and done with. So he storms the city thinking that he will have overwhelming advantage, but because he gets trapped in the narrow alleyways and the steep decline, he actually faces disaster, and people are able to hurl rocks at his soldiers from above. We don't know what the death toll was. Josephus claims all the Roman soldiers involved in that little exercise were killed. Vespasian had to back out very carefully and then try to encourage his troops and so on. So then the siege would make sense, right? Then you turn to a more passive siege. If you have a disaster like that, then you say, okay, let's starve them out. Let's build embankments. Let's just secure the area. That's the best I can come up with, Ron, as a reason for the length of it. That they tried storming, and then it didn't work, and so then they were left to wait. But I'm not sure about the month. In the case of Gamla, I think it was somewhat shorter, maybe 2.5, 3 weeks. It's still long. That's the best I can do.
Okay, thank you. Very good. I know there are other people wanting to ask questions. I think we're a little long on time here. So
there's one more who was, I think, ahead of the one.
Oh, right. Thank you, Tess.
Perhaps. Matthew, is it?
Matthew. Very good. Okay, Matthew, I'll take you off mute. If you can ask a relatively quick question, then that would be great, if I can indeed.
Yeah, so if it seems like only a few cities were besieged or actually attacked in this war, might that explain why the Bar Kokhba War in some sense happened? That is, that Judea was able to fight back, and I believe that was actually more significant for the Romans because they depicted a defeat, or that it was somehow seen as a more costly war for them.
Yeah, I think there's no direct relation. I mean, Jerusalem's now been in ruin for 2 generations by the time that Aelia Capitolina is built, and that sets off its own reactions. So I'm not sure. There could be all kinds of connections in people's minds, but I think again we need to think realistically about what happens in 2 generations. It's not like we have a tendency to compress things, right? From our vantage point 2,000 years later, it all looks, the error of parallax, so to speak, it compresses everything together. So I think the Bar Kokhba revolt had its own causes. Nevertheless, there may well be all kinds of connections in people's minds. The only thing I would say about the scale of the revolt, coming to your question, is, of course, there's a difference here among scholars. So Werner Eck argued for the massive scale of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and Menachem Moore, in his book, has challenged much of what Eck argued. So I think, the evidence for that conflict is so scattered and so difficult that there are many possibilities, and I wouldn't want to make a big judgment about it.
Steve, thank you very much. So I think that we now need to bring this to a close. Once again, enormous thanks to you for an absolutely outstanding lecture, and thank you for all the questions that you have answered so clearly.